Um, so having done this for a while, we get the benefit of seeing the good and the bad of any business. And so what this allows me to do is put together really great presentations where I can tell you all the things that you shouldn't do. Hopefully you'll leave here with a couple of aha, and hopefully not a lot of, oh my God, I've got to go, run immediately to my telephone and fix this. Some of these things are small issues that are easy fixes. Some of these things that we're going to talk about can be major issues for a company. So in 5 minutes, I don't have a ton of time to go through all of the points, but we're going to try to hit as many as I can quickly. But let's start with founders. One thing to think about when you're first forming your company and issuing your shares to your founders is don't ever issue shares to founders without a vesting schedule. If you think about it from a practical standpoint, if you issue all of the founders' shares and they vest immediately, why should they, what's the impetus to continue to work? You already are vested. You have all your shares. Maybe you let the other two founders do the work and you could go off and do something else. So you always want to, anytime you issue shares, whether that's to founders, to employees, to whomever it is, you always want to have a vesting schedule. It ensures that whomever you're issuing your shares to continue to work. Okay? Another problem that we've seen with founders is failing to get the IP from the founder into the company. When you issue shares, or when a company issues shares to a founder, they're supposed to issue it for something, whatever that consideration may be. Most of the time, it's a little bit of capital. Sometimes it's work previously done, but most of the time, it's some type of intellectual property, whether that's a business plan, whether it's an actual invention, whether it, who knows. But whatever that IP is, make sure that it actually gets into the company. Because if it doesn't get into the company and the founder still owns it, and there's a dispute between this founder and the other founders, the one that has the IP is just going to take his toys and go home. And that leaves a company with no business and no technology. So make sure that when you're issuing your shares for technology or for intellectual property, that the intellectual property is actually transferred to the company. Employee mistakes. Let's talk about employee mistakes. One of the mistakes that we see a lot is misclassification of employees. That's either misclassifying employees as exempt when they're not, or treating employees as independent contractors. I see that the most, where you treat everybody as an independent contractor. You sign everybody up as independent contractors, and you don't take withholdings, and you're not paying your payroll taxes or Social Security on the wages of employees. Big problem, as this gentleman just said, that was the death knell for his company. So when you are hiring an individual to perform services for your company, you really want to ascertain whether or not that person truly is an independent contractor. Is it a project-based deal? Do they have to come into your office to do the work? Do they have to perform the work on certain timelines? Are they paid by the hour, or are they paid just to deliver the product? Do they use their own tools, or do they have to use your tools? A lot of all these factors move them into independent contractor box or employee box, and you want to make sure that you classify them properly. Another one, employees in California, employees cannot work without being paid. Now, this tends to run contrary to the very nature of startup culture, but interns who are not receiving school credit and volunteers, they can create wage and hour issues. I'm sure those of you that were in the entertainment industry are very aware of the intern lawsuits that that happened over the last couple of years with, I think Black Swan was the last big one, right? Like huge, and they're usually the basis of class action lawsuits. So, just remember, nobody can work for free. And even in our own firm, we have the issue of our summer associates. There are summer attorneys. There are second and first year attorneys that we hire from law schools. So they're not really attorneys, but they're learning. They're not exempt, and our labor employer told us, oh, I'm sorry, you can't work them past 5:30. They have to go home because we're not going to pay them time and a half. Let's talk about some of the IP issues that can happen when dealing with either employees coming from a company or founders coming from a different company. Because it's not uncommon when you're starting a startup, it's not uncommon for founders to work full-time on their day job while they're trying to launch a startup. What are the problems that can arise from that? Well, if a founder uses his employer's facilities, his computers, their equipment, or their technology during company time or even after company time to work on the startup's business, that can create a problem. How many people are big fans of HBO Silicon Valley? Okay, so does everybody remember the issue facing Pied Piper and the arbitration, right, with Hulu? That was the exact issue. Because the technology for Pied Piper was created while the main character was working at Hulu, and I think it was even like created on Hulu computers and stored on a Hulu server. And the whole issue in the arbitration had to do with whether or not Hulu owned the technology or Pied Piper owned the technology. Because if you're an employee and you create technology within the course and scope of your employment, that technology may very well be owned by your employer. If it's something that's the subject of copyright, which source code is, then the employer would own the copyright in that source code. So it can be just a hornet's nest of intellectual property issues. And thank you. And that's one that really can have a disastrous impact on your company. Let's see. I want to go through a real good one here. Here's another important one. I have 1 minute left. Brands. We live in a brand-centric world. Consumers decide what products they want to use, what services they want to use, primarily based on brands. Services are very important, but it's the brand that's the primary draw. So when you're deciding on the brand name for your company or your service, you want to make sure that you do your due diligence before you choose your brand and roll out a big advertising campaign and spend a lot of money on syncing that brand in with your consumers. If you fail to do due diligence, if you just pick a brand out of the air, or you do a Google search and you're like, oh, that's cool, I didn't see anything, we can go with this brand, you're running a big risk of getting a cease and desist letter from someone whose brand you may be infringing. So, make sure that you take the proper steps. And what might that be? Well, you should hire a trademark lawyer who can do a trademark search, who can tell you whether or not your use of your proposed trademark will infringe the rights of a third party, or whether it's clear for use. And I'm done with my 1 minute.
All right, very good, thank you. Questions?
No? No questions for the lawyer. I love that. I never get no questions. It's fantastic.
I think at this point for us, it's been kind of tricky. We need so many different.
Yes.
We need an entertainment lawyer, a trademark lawyer, a startup lawyer, and we can't afford all of those lawyers at this point. So that's just the challenges at a startup level. So I just kind of wonder what you think about that, and is there any?
That's actually seriously. That's a really good question. When you have a limited amount of capital, what do you focus on, right?
I like to protect the company.
Yeah. What do you need? What do you need to do to get you to the place where you can have some capital so you can spend some more on some other things? There's foundational legal work that needs to be done, right? You need to form your entity, you need to issue your shares to your founders, you need to do like all that basic work to get you in a place where you can, operate, okay? Most lawyers who work with startups do that on a deferred basis. So that's a good thing right there. That's number one. Your next thing, if you're a consumer-facing company and you actually have a product, brand. Like brand is probably number two. And so I would spend a little bit of money on a trademark attorney and make sure that your brand is clear. Don't know that you need to register it yet. It's never a bad idea. It's always a good idea to register if you can afford it. But if you can't, you certainly want to have a search run just to make sure that your brand is clear to use. The next thing that I would deal with is just get some basic advice on independent contractor versus employees. Like what can you do, what can't you do, who's an independent contractor and who's an employee, and have a lawyer give you a good independent contractor template that you can use with all of your independent contractors because the biggest issue with using independent contractors and not having a written agreement is you don't own the IP. And that's a huge issue. So you want to make sure you have a good template that effectively transfers the intellectual property to the company. That should, I give those away. Like that should be free and or next to nothing. So that's number three. And really, if you have that, and you just have someone that you can call and is willing to be your partner, because lawyers that work with startups, whether it's startup technology companies, whether it's a startup production company, we partner because we understand that when you become successful, we will be able to bill you normally, and you will be grateful to us for the fact that we were around during your lean years and helped you get to a place where you are now. At least that's the way that it's supposed to operate in the yin and yang of it all. But I think if you have those three things, and then someone you can talk with and ask questions to, I think you'll be okay.
How about an ongoing resource to review agreements and NDAs and all those things that pop up for people?
Yeah, I mean, here's what your lawyer, when you work with a startup lawyer, you can have a template NDA, which would be great, and that's something that you could use very frequently. If you actually have an operating product, whether it's a technology product, consumer product, whatever it is, if you actually have something that you're selling and providing services or whatever, spend a couple of bucks and have a service template or a sales template or whatever that contract is. Spend a couple of bucks and have a template that you can use. Ask the lawyer to give you a lot of options and explain what they are so you can do a lot of the work yourself. I really don't think that that's not going to run a whole heck of a lot. If you're running an online business, obviously you've got terms of service and privacy policies that you need for your website. That's not going to break the bank either. I think probably in total, everything that we talked about should not run you more than $5,000. So, yes?
Scott, going back to the IP, well, the difference between transfer of IP to an LLC versus a C Corp, is it different?
No.
Because we're faced with something.
No, fundamentally, it's not going to be any different. A limited liability company stands as its own legal entity. The tax treatment, right? An LLC is usually a flow-through entity for tax treatment, and usually the distribution of distributable cash models can be different than a C corp, which is there's no money that goes out until a sale or dividends, and there's two tiers of taxation. But other than that, they're entities, they're their own entity, and it shouldn't be any different.
But how they run them is different. I mean, we're faced with a really.
Well, I mean,
challenging situation.
you're talking about governance. Corporate governance between a C corp and an LLC
Exactly.
are different, but that should not have any impact on the transferability of intellectual property. And I see that the water skier has fallen into the water,
Right.
so we must circle back around and pick him up.
All right, so Ben, thank you, Scott.